We begin with the second session now. The theme for this session is 1971 Indo-Pak War Projections. We have an exemplary panel for this session chaired by Dr. Manpreet Sethi. Dr. Sethi is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Force Studies and leads the project on nuclear security. She's an expert on the entire range of nuclear issues with over 100 papers in academic journals of repute to her credit. Dr. Sethi lectures regularly at the National Defense College and other leading establishments of Indian Armed Forces, police and foreign services. She has been participant in all flagship nuclear policy conferences of USA, Russia, EU, China and India. In a rare honor for a civilian on Air Force Day 2020, she was commended by the Chief of the Air Staff for her dedication and professional ability. A warm welcome to you, ma'am. I request you to kindly take over.
Thank you very much, Zoya, and good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to session 2 of this seminar on the Indo-Pak War, 50 years of 1971. And I must say that I'm truly honored to be in the chair in this session, having grown up hearing my father tell me stories about 1971, and it's been so humbling to meet so many of the war heroes here today morning. We've already examined some of the dimensions of the 1971 war in the session that just finished. In this session, we plan to turn our eyes to some of the other operations, particularly in the West, and also try and extrapolate, as was said in the previous session, some of the lessons for the future. So what is the situation today in 2021, which is different from what it was in 1971? You know, as the chair in the previous session said, what is the environment today, and how is that now going to shape the application of air power? And we'll try and, bring out some of those dimensions in this session. Since the time is rather tight and much ground needs to be covered, I'm going to call upon our first speaker, Air Marshal B.K. Bhatia, PVSM, AVSM, Veer Chakra Bar, to make his presentation on offensive operations in the West. Air Marshal Jimmy Bhatia is well known to all of us as an old colleague for many of you, and as a legend for the younger officers for his daredevilry, especially during the Kargil War. I have heard several stories about those. He also has the rare distinction of having been the Commander-in-Chief of 3 operational commands of the Indian Air Force. He's presently President of the RCDS Association of India, as also on the executive councils of both IDSA, Manohar Parrikar IDSA, and USI. Besides, of course, we at CAPS are extremely honored, sir, to have you as a distinguished fellow at the center. May I now request you, sir, to take the floor, and I will also gently remind you that it's 15 minutes for each speaker, and I've been told by the organizers to be a strict timekeeper. Yes. So.
Yeah. Yep. Oh. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Much has been said in the morning session. So what I will do is, I'll try and keep it light, to the point, and perhaps within 15 minutes that have been allotted to me. But before I start my presentation, let me also say that I'm very happy to hear what happens across the border as far as the synergy between the Army and the Air Force is concerned. And I only hope and wish that it does not happen here. Let me also tell everybody present here that I think the synergy between the 3 services during the 1971 war was really exemplary. And having said that, I will now spend the next 15 minutes to take you on a small ride, a light ride, not very serious, to tell you as to what happened on the western front. It was not all quiet. Since its very inception in August 1947, when India and Pakistan were partitioned in conformity to a two-nation theory, Pakistan's military high command had always believed that the defense of its eastern wing lies in the west and adopted it as its war doctrine. 1971, ladies and gentlemen, was no different. The strategic role of the Pak forces in the east was to hold out till the Pakistanis had defeated India in the west, and there was a very, very grandiose plan to do that. Bulk of the Pak forces were therefore, as we all know, they were deployed in the west. As far as the Pakistani Air Force is concerned, it had deployed just one squadron of F-36 Sabres, albeit slightly augmented UE with a few T-birds and so on in East Pakistan, while the rest of the aircraft remained in the west. India's war philosophy was just the opposite, with the point of decision being in the east. The Air Chief Marshal Pratap Chand Lal, led IF in consonance, had deployed its forces with such numerical strength in the east so as to overwhelm the Pakistani Air Force by unleashing an all-out offensive in the shortest possible time and attain absolute air superiority. This not only helped the Indian ground forces to operate freely in enemy territory, but also made possible the famous Tangle drop that resulted in the race to Dhaka for its subsequent fall in record time. It was well documented and presented during the first session. In the western sector, however, IF adopted a different policy of a calibrated approach, with the aim of causing as much attrition as possible to the enemy, but keeping own losses under control. It was appreciated that territorial gains in the western sector was not as much of an aim as preventing the enemy to make advances into Indian territory. The air campaign in the west was structured accordingly. As mentioned earlier, but for the lone squadron of combat aircraft in the east, Pakistani Air Force had amassed 12 squadrons in the west, consisting of 104 Starfighters, Sabres, Mirages, MiG-19, and B-57s. This was also covered in the morning session. In addition, it had also received a squadron worth of F-104s from Jordan and about 35 Sabres from Saudi Arabia and Iran. That is almost 3 squadron worth. As you know, Pakistani Air Force squadrons have 12 aircraft in each squadron. But with as many as 11 squadrons deployed in the east by the Indian Air Force, it can be seen that there was near parity that existed in the western sector. Once again, it was brought out in detail in the first section. In pursuance of IIF's overall aims, broadly of defending its bases against enemy air attacks, at the same time conduct counter-air operations to reduce PAF's effectiveness by destroying its aircraft and bases, as also provide support to the Army and Navy. Headquarters WAC, under guidance from Air Headquarters, had carried out meticulous planning months in advance for air operations in the western sector. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing was left to chance. All squadrons and units had been given specific roles for their primary and secondary tasks, and they were well defined. For example, MiG-21s and NATs were given air defense as their primary role and were deployed accordingly at different Indian Air Force bases for air defense and escort duties. In a similar fashion, all ground attack squadrons were given counter-air and counter-surface force targets. The targets were allotted keeping in mind the war locations of the squadrons in their respective sectors and their low radii of action capabilities. Selected squadrons, such as number 32 Thunderbirds and number 20 Lightning's Hunters, were chosen to exploit their niche deep penetration capability for such tasks that could not be allotted to similar squadrons, which did not have this capability. And I'm here referring to their range capability, which was according to them because of long-range wing drop tanks. Maps prepared for the missions and pre-briefings done. I have waited for the balloon to go up. Some information was available on December the 1st that Pakistan was likely to strike in a day or two. Under the circumstances, IF could very well have preempted the PAF, but the government of India took prudent decision to let Pakistan do the honors and strike first. When the sneaky preemptive assault by Pakistan Air Force fighters against 11 IF airfields in the western sector on the evening of December 3 actually came, it was nothing like the fury of Genghis Khan, after which the operation was named. It was actually a tame affair, as the strikes were carried out in hurried single passes with runways as the primary targets, causing only superficial damage at some airfields. The Indian Air Force, which already had an inkling of the possibility of such actions by the PAF, was fully prepared, with its aircraft generally tucked away into the covered blast pens which had been erected during the period between 1965 and 1971, very prudently. The half-hearted PAF strikes followed by a declaration of war by the slurring, somewhat inebriated Pak President General Yahya Khan, where he decided to teach a lesson to traitor India for meddling in its internal affairs. It had a quick response from Mrs. Gandhi, and this also opened the doors for the IF to roll out its well-planned campaign without India being labeled as the aggressor. IF's counter air response was swift, but before that I'll show you a map here which generally depicts the kind of air operations which were conducted in the West. It included counter-air, interdiction, arming, co-op, photo reconnaissance as well, and of course the energy targets. Coming back to IF's counter-air, which was swift, all-encompassing, but well-calibrated, aimed at causing as much attrition as possible during the opening stages of the war, while ensuring that IF's own losses did not spiral out of control. The first retaliatory strikes on PAF airfields were of course conducted on the same night by Canberra bombers from Central Air Command, operating out of Agra and Pune. Western Air Command, on the other hand, was entrusted with the task of carrying out attacks on Pakistan Air Force bases. This I'm talking about the daylight attacks. Sargodha, Shaukat Road, Peshawar, Chakala, Muri, Chande, Chakjhumra, Risalwala, Masroor, Rig Road, you name it, and the radar stations at Lahore, Sakeza, and Badin. Fighter squadrons, as I mentioned earlier, was pre-selected for specific counter-air tasks depending upon their locations, and the planning had been done in the preceding months before the outbreak of war. As I mentioned earlier, 20th Squadron, for example, had this 230-gallon drop tanks, and they were given Peshawar and Mianwali as their targets. Similarly, the OCU hunters from Jamnagar, once again with those long-range tanks, had been given tasks in the Karachi area. The only Su-7 squadron with 900-liter long-range wing drop tanks was given the task to take on PAF's Shaukat Road base, which was located in some depth in southwestern Multan sector of Punjab province in Pakistan. Incidentally, there was a lot of mystery attached to Shaukat Road, considered to be a secret base of the Pakistani Air Force. As far as I remember, there was no mention of Shaukat Road during the 1965 operations. Presumably, the base came up in between during the interim period of 6 years. Its existence was first revealed by the PF Bengali defectors during their interrogation by Indian intelligence agencies just months prior to the war. Even during the planning stage, we were unsure of its exact location. True probable positions were plotted on the map and nav planning done for both, which situation remained unchanged till the first op mission was actually flown on the morning of December 4, led by me as Eagle 1, then the youngest squadron leader in our unit. The Eagles also included Sathe, Tambe, Grewal, young flight lieutenants, as my number 2, 3, and 4. Actually, on the third evening when the strike took place, most of us were at Ambala. We had come from our base at Amritsar. But while TAC Day went into action on the same night along with the Canberras for counter-air operations, we were asked to go at the crack of dawn to Amritsar. We took off early morning and landed at Amritsar off low-level circuits. The aircraft were quickly turned around and were ready for by 9 o'clock. If I remember correctly, our first duty was 10:45, broad daylight. We flew in a loose, broad frontage formation, keeping as low as possible all the way through, stepping up our heights only a wee bit to actually clear the high-tension cables and pylons south of Lahore. Strict silence, and we waited with a bated breath to see whether our plotted position was going to be right or wrong. The suspense was building up, and after the initial point when I pulled up for the attack, it was a sheer delight to see the enemy airfield right in front and below us. We went in for the attack and spotted a large number of their aircraft which were actually in the open in front of their pens. These are the pens which were attacked, you can see on the slide. And this is the first rocket attack which I was talking about. You can see the aircraft where the rockets are exploding. And one more aircraft you see which was taken in the second pass in the right-hand top corner of this gun camera shot. Sathe, who was flying as my number 2, he spotted a B-57 Canberra. There were 2 of them actually, and with Bowsers being refueled in the open blast pens, and he took them on. The second attack was equally successful. It appeared that we had taken the enemy completely by surprise, as not a single round of attack was fired at us. The strike turned out to be very successful, 1 with Canberra and Bowser and 3 Cybers as confirmed kills. I have mentioned here that Chief Marshal Lal had given a clear instruction that all the claims will only be given by analyzing properly the gun camera shots, and that is how the claims were given. If there was the slightest doubt, then they were given into the probable category. This is how it happened. We, the Eagles, carried out 2 more raids against Shokot Road in the next 24 hours, totaling up to a maximum day strikes against a single air base in the west during the war. At the end of these 3 raids, a total of 7 enemy aircraft were awarded as confirmed kills, as I mentioned, through gun camera analysis. But it was not a walk in the park for us, except for the first sortie. In the second sortie, which was in the evening, and subsequently the third sortie the next day, we were welcomed by dense attack fire, and in the process, we lost 2 aircraft to enemy attack over the airfield. During the evening strike, we were also chased by the Pakistani Air Force Sabres, and as mentioned in the morning session, we didn't have much fuel actually to take them on in combat, but the evasive action actually proved to be successful, and they did fire their missiles, but we were flying so low that they were seduced by the ground clutter, and they landed in between the formation ahead of us and exploded in the canals below. Further north, under the dynamic leadership of Wing Commander C.V. Parker, number 20 Squadron Lightnings, they were unleashed to attack Peshawar and Mianfali airfields, as also Sakesa Radar and Atak oil refinery. But equally glorious, if not more, were the lightning attacks on Chaklala, Islamabad, as also Murid, which came within the first few days of the war. Among the air warriors in the squadron was a naval aviator on exchange posting from the Navy, namely Lieutenant Arun Prakash, later Admiral and Chief of Naval Staff of the Indian Navy. You can spot him with his white naval shoes, second from the left. He is the guy who actually also destroyed a twin-engine Beech craft belonging to USAF Brigadier General Charles Yeager, the famous Chuck Yeager, first to break the sound barrier while flying the Bell X-1, who had been assigned to Pakistan to advise the Pakistan Air Force before the war. He was so livid with the destruction of his beloved aircraft that he directly accused Mrs. Indira Gandhi for having specifically instructed Arun to blast his plane. It's quite interesting to note that out of all the aircraft which were destroyed on the ground in the West, between Lightnings and the Thunderbirds, actually we perhaps could claim 2/3 of them between us. Now, like Hunters and Su-7s and number 20s and 32 squadrons operating from Pathankot and Amritsar, Su-7s from Halwara, Hunters from Jaisalmer and Jamnagar, and Maruts from Utalai also carried out daylight counter air sorties against PF airfields in their respective sectors, with varied results. Apart from this, Badin radar was also attacked with reasonable success by the MiG-21s of 47th Squadron, of course with the loss of their CO, Wing Commander Gill. At the same time, Canberra bombers and fighters from Tagde continued with the night attacks against the Pakistani airfields, which we have spoken about enough. However, as stated earlier, main aim of the counter campaign was to force the Pakistani Air Force to go on the defensive while causing as much attrition as possible. Once the main aim had been achieved, in the first few days of the war, counter-air campaign gave way to, for the IF to fully focus now on counter-surface force operations. As I had stated earlier, the entire gamut of counter-surface force operations comprising interdiction, close air support, even search and strike missions had been well planned and forces actually catered for in each sector. Ad hocism was truly a thing of the past. While forces had been pre-assigned for Army close air support, both pre-planned and immediate, what the tapering of the counter-air campaign did was to set free a large quantum of additional air effort for augmenting the interdiction campaign.
Forgive me for interrupting, sir. We are almost above time a little bit.
Okay, I am just 2 to 3 minutes left. So, Pakistan being a linear country, as we know, with its lines of communication running parallel to the international border with India, interdiction of communication, that means the railway system, was given a lot of focus. And as you know, the Pakistani marshalling yards and their trains were actually attacked en masse. It was a sheer delight when you went for a search and strike mission and you pulled up and you saw a Pakistani army train chugging along, and the best way was to first immobilize the train by hitting the locomotive and then take on the rest of the train. Coming to close air support, much has been spoken about. Once again, I mention here that sufficient focus was given to close air support. There was an alarm on December 6th when, at that time, General Manik Shah, who was also the Chairman Chief of Staff Committee, when he said that all available aircraft should go for close air support. But later on, it turned out to be a false alarm because there was sufficient effort was already available, which the Army could utilize for the close air support. Notwithstanding that, the IF even turned to doing search and strike missions in close air support role also, where a clearly defined bomb line had been given to them. Talking about close air support, the real crown jewel, I would say, as far as the IF is concerned, perhaps was Longawala, We have spoken enough about it, but to say that when the forces were daylighted, just a handful of hunters, how they decimated the Pakistani armor, and you can see it on the slide. You can also see a desperate SOS call by a Subroto major of the Pakistani forces asking for the Pakistani Air Force to come in for help. And as we know, they never turned up. Last bit is that this was for the first time that the energy targets had also been planned meticulously by the Indian Air Force to cripple the Pakistani economy to the extent possible. And therefore, there were attacks carried out by hunters on Atak refinery. You can see the slide here. There's a beautiful painting here by Dev Gohin showing the hunters who actually were the first to light the fires in Karachi. And that is how it stopped. I shall now end here by just giving you a slide on assessing IF's offensive in the West. As we know, it was well orchestrated counter-air campaign to put PF on the back foot in the initial stages of war. That was the starting point. Focused introduction of Pak communication systems and logistics areas, well coordinated and adequate closure support as per Army's requirements. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say, while the IF acted as a spearhead in the Indian military's blitzkrieg to Dhaka in the east, in the west it stood as a wall to thwart any offensive design of Pak Army to violate India's territorial integrity. How did we do in the war? I think best to quote Air Chief Marshal Lal when he asked the question, how did we perform in December 1971, and also gave the answer. Well, we can say we didn't do too badly. In fact, we did rather well. We won the war. Mission accomplished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Eagle 1. Thank you. Thank you for the detailed picture of the operations in the West. I felt terrible interrupting a story which was being told so well. But as you know, sir, picture abhi baki hai, and we have 2 or more speakers for our session today. So our second speaker in this session is Mr. PVS Jagan Mohan, a renowned historian of the Indian Air Force. He has 3 books on IAF and its conflicts, and he has assisted in several other history projects over the years, including some exceptional work at USI. Not surprisingly then, he was awarded a Chief of Air Staff Commendation in 2007. We are happy that he's joining us from the US today, and it's past midnight, Mr. Mohan, if you can hear us now, that you're joining us. Thank you, sir, for making this possible, and we are looking forward to listening to you now for the next 15 minutes on the bombing saga in the 1971 war. Can we have Mr. Jagan Mohan up now? Thank you very much, Mr. Mohan. Really appreciate your staying up early into the morning to make this presentation for us. And being a student of history, one can well understand how much you wanted to share. Thank you for that. Our final speaker for this session is our very own Dr. Shalini Chavla, Distinguished Fellow at CAPS and a well-known authority on Pakistan and Afghanistan. For many years now, she has been a member of core groups at various think tanks where we are all trying to make sense of the complex security situation that Pakistan poses to us in the region. Over the years of her research, Dr. Chavla has written 3 books and scores of very well analyzed papers, besides of course taking lectures at various military institutions and universities. It was recognition of her stellar work at the center on national security that she was awarded the Chief of Air Staff Commendation last year on Air Force Day. Congratulations. Given her grip on the subject, in my view, we could not have had a better person to explain to us how the 1971 war altered the strategic posture of Pakistan, and what we are dealing with today is a different kind of Pakistan than what we had in 1971. So Shalini, over to you for the next 15 minutes, and I'm hoping she'll be the only one who'll listen to me on the time.
बेटा कैसे करना है ये भी बताना। पहले इसको पहले खोलो।
Okay.
ये खोलो।
Thank you so much for drawing our attention, and thank you, sir, for being here with us.
ये भी रख दो। Good afternoon, everybody. I'll start by admitting that I really enjoyed working on the book, such beautifully written papers. And when DG actually called me and said 4 months, I said, are you serious, 4 months? But then, you know, our DG, I realized while working on the book that he literally personifies Air Force. So while working with him, I've also learned to kind of work on that speed. And thank you all of you for contributing such beautifully written paper. And we've had a wonderful series of talks since morning. Now I'm going to be talking about how did the 1971 war alter Pakistan's strategic posture. We see a Pakistan which is a very, very, you know, a country of contradictions. And many times when I think that as an analyst on Pakistan, what's going to be my last book, the ultimate book, maybe it will be making sense of Pakistan. And by that time, in the next, say, 20, 30 years, I might have learned something more about Pakistan. So the 1971 war definitely was the defining moment, the decisive, you know, period in terms of changing the overall dynamics in Pakistan's thinking, its strategy, its policy, and now how did it want to conduct itself with India. To begin with, what is the Pakistan's strategic posture vis-a-vis India that we see today? We see Pakistan as a nation which is perpetually highlighting its threat perception. The threat perception and the narrative of threat perception is an essential, I would say, domain for Pakistan. You know, they're perpetually highlighting a threat of being a smaller country, India being a larger country, having more assets, being under threat from the major powers. So the threat perception dominates the strategy making, the projection of threat perception. Deep reliance on sub-conventional war, projection of a low nuclear threshold. Again, projection of a low nuclear threshold. Actually, the threshold is low? No. Build-up of the conventional capability, and that's why it got into the alliance with the United States of CETO and CENTO in the late 50s and 60s, and then China, how it has kind of evolved in its relationship with China. Military, basically, it was a military relationship from the beginning. And then very importantly, intensifying the anti-India narrative that we have seen throughout, and we have seen it much more aggressively in the last, say, 5 years now. If I go back and say before we come to how 1975 changed the dynamics, I would just briefly like to kind of talk about what are the determinants of Pakistan's strategic posture. And I would say 3 of them, which are interdependent and they influence each other constantly. And none of them allows the other one to die. So the identity crisis, Pakistan born as a Muslim state, rejected theocracy, but all throughout its journey, in the last 75 years, it has been unsure of the version of Islam it wanted to adopt for itself. And we have seen variations from Jinnah's concept, then Bhutto's socialism, Zia's radical Islam, Musharraf's enlightened moderation. So we have seen those changes. So it always kind of struggled for its identity. That identity crisis led to the domination of the military, and the military never allowed the identity crisis to settle down. Along with that also, because of the identity crisis, it had the deep desire to stay at par with India, specifically in the conventional military of India. And that again strengthened the military, and military never allowed that desire to go down. So all these 3 factors continued to dominate and shape up the strategic posture of Pakistan. The most important part, I think, after 1971 war, which till now you would see that Pakistan has not been able to absorb and settle down, was, I think, the ideological shift where we saw the alliance of mullah, mosque, and military now shaping up, emerging, and then intensifying in varied forms. Pakistani leadership projected the formation of Bangladesh as a betrayal of Pakistan by East Pakistan. There was this deep fear of further segmentation and perceived threat of division of Pakistan, which was felt. and propagated to come and, define the other objectives and reach the other objectives, for example, the nuclear capability, which I'm just going to come. The fear of further segmentation was all because of the fact that there was perpetual insurgency in Baluchistan, there was restlessness in KPK, which was then known as NWFP. So the answer that Pakistani leadership found to unify the country was the adoption of the radical religious ideology. And while this thought process in Pakistan was taking strength, what we also saw simultaneously that in the 1970s and the 80s, the world witnessed the re-emergence of Islam as a potent global force. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's idea of Islamic socialism started to come into being, and Islam was being now seen as a major factor of statecraft. And since 1972, what we saw in Pakistan was a struggle to turn Pakistanis into good Muslims. Then Zia took the whole pursuit forward, and he adopted radical Islam, introduction of the radical reforms, and the most important aspect of those reforms were the introduction of the Islamic reforms in the education system, which are obviously having the impact till now and which changed the mindset of the younger generation in Pakistan. And then very importantly, Islamization of the Pakistan Army. Now, Islamization of the Pakistan Army was a critical aspect at that time. Jihad was included as motto of the Pakistan Army. Religious teachers were given the rank of commissioned officers in the Pakistan Army. And very importantly, what happened at the middle level and the lower level, we had a very radical mindset being recruited, straight madrasa graduate into the military, which were nurtured to propagate and embrace radical Islam. The Islamist party, Tabligh Jamaat, linked to the Deobati tradition, got much more access to the military officials. Next factor, which was very critical after 1971 war, was the making of the bomb and Bhutto's conviction that nuclear weapon was now indispensable to be able to unify the country, to protect the country and deter India. He held the Multan meeting in 1972 January under a Shamiana and asked those 200 scientists that when can they do the bomb? They said 5 years. He said no, he wanted it in 3 years. And the scientists said, yes, we can do it. You will have the bomb. Money was raised from the Muslim world in the name of Islamic bomb, and the ideological factor was strengthened. Close to $1,000 million came from the Muslim world for the acquisition of the bomb. Along with the nuclear weapon acquisition, obviously nuclear ambiguity for Pakistan became very critical. Firstly, because of the nuclear objectives that it carried. The nuclear objectives for Pakistan were obviously war prevention, to deter India from any military action in retaliation of the terror attacks that it wanted to now go ahead with the covert war. And secondly, also the acquisition of the nuclear weapons were done in the illegitimate manner from China, and all that combined obviously made nuclear ambiguity a very critical aspect of the whole domain of nuclear. Now, if we see the nuclear doctrine, I'm not going into the detail, but throughout nuclear doctrine has has evolved, and there has been a pattern of thinking that we see. Before the overt nuclearization, Pakistan talked about a very, very low nuclear threshold, using the bomb at any time, whenever it felt threatened. Then what we saw in Pakistan, that they talked about using nuclear weapon as the last resort, then weapon of restraint and nuclear weapon power of restraint and responsibility, and then eventually now we have the full spectrum deterrence. But even though the stated positions have varied, but what are the underlying factors in the nuclear doctrine and the first use doctrine? It's an unwritten doctrine. It continuously maintains a projection of uncertainty. It maintains a projection of irrationality, making the other person to believe that it's a mad country, can do anything, anytime. Projection of a very, very low nuclear threshold, and I would say that it has very rationally maintained a projection of irrationality. Whether this projection was now challenged, yes, it was with the Balakot strike, but will Pakistan change the projection? No. Terror as an instrument, became an important part of thinking, and we see this major shift after the 1971 war, and how now terror as an instrument. I mean, they used covert war in 1947, even in 1965, but now the use of terror was given more legitimacy, and also institutionalization of terror as an instrument started to become, and interpretation of war strategy based on the Holy Quran was being done and embraced by the military. And the most, I would say, a comprehensive work was done by Brigadier S.K. Malik in his book, The Quranic Concept of War, where Zia-ul-Haq wrote the foreword, and where terror as jihad was legitimized. And I would just bring out two quotes from the book, and the book was published in 1976. When God wishes to impose his will upon his enemies, he chooses to do so by casting terror in their heart. Terror struck into the hearts of the enemies is not only a means, it is an end in itself. So nuclear weapon is seen as a weapon of terror, and military has relied on the strategy of using terror as an instrument, and it was supported by the interpretations, or rather I would call it misinterpretations, of the teachings of Holy Quran. The grand strategy started to take a different shape after the 1971 war, and two factors in the grand strategy were now important. One was to expand the Pakistani territory eastward, take Kashmir, and that meant rise in the covert activities in Jammu and Kashmir, radical Islam in the name of jihad, and secondly, to expand control westward to gain leverage in Kabul, creating strategic depth in Afghanistan. And now we have seen what now finally in its own mind, it feels that it has fulfilled its whole concept of creating strategic depth in Afghanistan. In the 1980s, religious resurgence coupled with increasing alienation of the youth for diverse reasons started to grow in Kashmir, and Pakistan's strategy became more concrete. In the 1980s itself, in 1989, we saw Mirza Aslam Beg, Pakistan Army chief, actually talked about the doctrine of offensive defense, in which offensive was the covert war factor, and the defense had to be provided by Pakistan's nuclear weapons. 1990s and 2000, Pakistan's covert war expanded to other parts of India with much more intensity, and it hasn't stopped. I won't go into the details of that. The its desire for strategic depth, the whole concept, I think, I link it that in the early 1970s when Bhutto started to project that Pakistan is not only a South Asian state, but it's a West Asian state also. The military and ISI authored and executed the policy of strategic depth in 1980s throughout the 1990s to fulfill their multiple strategic objectives of now controlling the Pashtun nationalism on their border. The disputed Durand line had to be managed in Pakistan's favor, and most importantly, denying India space in Afghanistan. And then we saw the intensification of these factors throughout. And then there has been a revision of the narrative, a revision of the posture. Underlying factors remain same. The revision of the posture, I saw it with the revocation of Article 370. This was an unexpected development for Afghanistan. Islamabad challenged Pakistan's identity and narrative because the entire narrative has been built up on Kashmir Banega Pakistan. Pakistan's identity built around the threat perception it had generated and nurtured over the decades. And I would say insecurity, like I said, has been a national narrative for Pakistan, and management of threat perceptions and narratives is critical for Pakistan. And 370 did challenge those narratives. So what we see from 2019 onwards, after the revocation, there has been aggressive efforts towards build-up of a revised narrative at the national and the international level. What are the shifts in those strategic posture? The throughout built narrative in Pakistan, what we have seen is India as a threat to Pakistan's sovereignty and survival. This has been maintained within Pakistan to raise the money for nuclear weapons, conventional arms, also for covert war, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, funded by the people of Pakistan as well. But now what is the emerging narrative? The emerging narrative is India as a threat to not only Pakistan, but to entire Muslim population. India's current ideology is dangerous for the world, is what Imran Khan has repeatedly asserted in about, I think, 95 tweets that he made. Pakistan talked about the first use from the beginning, unwritten doctrine to enhance deterrence, and it said that it is willing to use nuclear weapons against India if it feels the need. So the projection of low threshold has been there since the beginning. Threshold is actually not low. What is the emerging narrative? The emerging narrative is high probability of a nuclear war between India and Pakistan. This scenario is a threat to the region and global security. So every narrative that Pakistan has now moved to a larger, wider arena of global security. Kashmir is an unfinished agenda of partition has been the narrative. The emerging narrative is Kashmir issue should be addressed by the world, and Kashmir is a global responsibility. And that's why it's taken to UNSC, and we have seen repeated, I mean, just before the Taliban takeover, there is a pause right now in that narrative. It's going to re-emerge. And Imran Khan said that if the world does nothing to stop the Indian assault on Kashmir and its people, two new armed states will get ever closer to a direct military confrontation. There was shift in March 2021 where we saw the agreement on the ceasefire. Bajwa came up with the Doctrine 2.0 by saying forget the past, and he said that the progress in relation depends upon a conducive environment on the side of Kashmir. Highlighting Islamophobia has been the narrative that we've seen in the last 3 years. Much more suppression of Muslims is the root cause of radicalization is what has been the new narrative. And Imran Khan's speech at the UN had several references to Islamophobia. The Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, obviously Pakistan sees it as a strategic victory. It doesn't realize that there are going to be fallouts. There will be fallouts for sure, but obviously that realization in a country like Pakistan is not going to be there. It will now try to use the Afghan soil to train and equip for the anti-India groups Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. We have already seen they have created a group which has now started to work in Afghanistan, and anti-India propaganda is likely to intensify. Now, what do we expect in future? The narrative of India will continue to evolve from Pakistan. What changes we saw after 1975 have evolved, intensified. Its narrative of victimhood will continue. That has never settled down, and it will take it forward. Consistent effort from Pakistan to shift the blame of radicalization and terrorism to India and the US and other factors. Its reliance on China will continue to grow, and now we will also see a Sino-Pak, the extension of the Sino-Pak alliance in Afghanistan, because both share a common objective of denying India space there. And China definitely wants to leverage the absence of United States, sees Afghanistan as a regional connector, has offered it to join CPC, but let's see how everything shapes up. That's a different discussion altogether. Islamabad will try and manage its relationship with the US judiciously, needs the US for sure. US also realizes that they cannot completely sideline Pakistan, so that little hot, warm relationship will continue. Effort to highlight Islamophobia will strengthen. Aggressive effort to internationalize Kashmir will continue, but after a pause. Vocal posturing of no nuclear threshold is likely to lie low for some time, but nuclear weapons will continue to play a critical role in conflict escalation, de-escalation between India and Pakistan obviously wants to bring in that factor repeatedly. It will continue to blame India's nuclear modernization having a destabilization effect on regional security environment, and Pakistan's strategic calculus and adoption of terror as a foreign policy tool is definitely not going to change. It's rather going to get strengthened. What is India going to do? India is doing, I think we are doing pretty well, but yes, our strengthening of our cooperation with the major powers, United States, a regional power, Russia, build-up of our conventional capability, stronger strengthening of our nuclear positioning the continuation of all this is definitely needed to deal with this evolving posture of Pakistan. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Shalini. You would all agree that we've had 3 great presentations, adding to the understanding of the jigsaw pieces of 1971 war. Now, before I throw the floor open, I want to add just a little bit of my understanding of the situation today, given the presence of nuclear weapons. As Shalini pointed out, the strategic posture of Pakistan changes, and one of the major ingredients of that is the presence of nuclear weapons. So the basic question that I have in my mind, which I've tried to tackle in the book as well, is another 1971 possible? And while one can never say never, I think we need to think about application of force a little differently, given that the landscape has changed for us quite drastically, also for Pakistan. Now, it's an unfortunate reality that we continue to talk about the possibility of war with Pakistan, but because they continue to use terrorism, there will be opportunities when, or there will be occasions when India will be required to use force. But the application of that force will have to think about the consequences. So while, the Air Chief said in the morning that we were able to do large-scale attrition, I think he mentioned that we destroyed a third of the Army, half of the Air Force, and 1/4 of the Navy. Can we do similar attrition in the current circumstances and believe that the nuclear weapon will not be used? So therefore, I think the point I want to highlight essentially is that with Pakistan's continued use of terrorism, India's response will have to be customized in such a manner that we are able to effectively cause punishment, give them a message, but without getting them to use their nuclear weapons. So the question of using your conventional force in the nuclear overhang is going to hang upon us in the future, but only when we signal the capability of being able to do so, that we can make the nuclear weapons redundant to our ability to use force, do we actually communicate something significant to Pakistan. And I think both some of the recent instances of the use of force and the manner in which we've employed it has managed to give that message to Pakistan. And it's important, I think, for at least 3 reasons to continue to, sharpen this message. One is to disabuse Pakistan of the assumption that its nuclear weapons have given it a free hand on terrorism and that India's hands are tied while its own hands have become freed because it now has nuclear weapons and it projects a low threshold, as was pointed out to us. Secondly, to turn around the view within our own country that we are deterred by a country which is much smaller and weaker conventionally than us, and yet we are not able to give it a punch that we really need to. So to turn around that view, we have to show that we can credibly use conventional force, and therefore the search for the right kinds of applications and instruments. And thirdly, to expose the brinkmanship of Pakistan, the fact that it says that it has a low threshold, that the moment India does any conventional action, there is going to be a response in return. We've not seen that happen in any of the crises which have turned out since 1999. So building on these experiences that we have of 2016, 2019, and comparing them with what happened with Op Parakram, we can craft out what kind of a strategy we need to have in order to communicate to Pakistan that we are going to hurt the perpetrators of terrorism. Now, in doing so, we have to choose our instruments carefully. And if I were to use a term that you use, sir, in your presentation, calibrate the use of force in such a way that it is effective and yet it is able to minimize the risk of escalation. So intelligent employment, as the previous chair had said in the morning. Air power then emerges as a clear victor in this. And I am not just saying the Indian Air Force. I'm saying air power, which could be utilized by through any of the platforms and through any of the services. But given that it has the advantages of quick engagement and disengagement, which is extremely important in today's times, surprise, strategic reach, precision possibilities to minimize collateral damage, and the ability to calibrate the lethality. All of these are advantages of air power, which will stand us in good stead in the times to come. And therefore, our force modernization has to keep this in mind in order to build up the capabilities that will be needed to best execute the use of force. And therefore, I think the right kind of platforms with adequate standoff ranges, force multipliers, ISR, precision guidance, training, and of course also missile power, which I include in air power. So I will end my remarks by just highlighting that the conduct of conventional operations in a nuclearized environment is an extremely challenging and a unique challenge to India. We are the only country which has to face a nuclear, nuclear-armed, what has been called an underdog nation, using terrorism against another nuclear-armed country. So while during the Cold War, we had these two, superpowers who were at each other's throats, but they were doing it in third countries, not on our own territories, and they didn't have the kind of complex challenges of history that we have with Pakistan. So the possibility of war is obviously present, but to successfully defeat and deter Pakistan, India needs to alter the calculus of its application of force. I know militaries don't like this idea, but I think we have to be practical and think about it in peacetime in order to arrive at more options that we can find on how to use that force that we have in order to change Pakistan's behavior on terrorism. Because essentially we are using conventional force against sub-conventional activity that they are carrying out. And for them, it's a very low-cost strategy which is unlikely to change in a hurry. So with that, I now throw the House open to questions, comments that you might have, and also from the online audience which is participating in this. Yes, sir, we'll start with you.
Talking about the West, great performance. But I was a little saddened that not a word has been mentioned about the contribution of vampires of Srinagar. The only visible gains, physical gains of 71 war in the West was the doing of these 8 vampires. There were 7 pilots, 8 aircrafts, 29 airmen. They looked after a border of 490 nautical miles from Sundarbani up to Shyok Valley. Our own experience going into the war was negligible. I was commanding the squadron 1-to-1. I had only 150 hours on type. I was duty ops. Never fired a bullet from the air. And I was the commanding officer. Frankly speaking, we did not know, I was a flight lieutenant, what was our task. No one to guide. One briefing we got from Udhampur, TAC commander, Group Captain I.S. Chavla, for 15 minutes for the whole station. And he says, this is the LOC. All targets beyond that are the enemy targets. When I questioned him, so how do I recognize what is the difference between our target float and theirs? At some places in Uri, some of the posts were separated only by 250 yards. He said, don't ask stupid questions. Anything beyond this is enemy lines. I was a flight lieutenant. I got bullshitted, so I kept quiet. So what I want to say is, we trained ourselves. We went to the GLO. He explained things. In that Srinagar station, the only ops room available was the GLO section. On one table also sat the MOF, warning from borders. When the war started, we had set up our own things in the tent. Since I had little spare time before the war started, I went to the CO 114HU. It's called Mohan Chandra. I said, sir, can I convert on your helicopter? I want to go up to the border to distinguish which is our post and which is theirs. He was kind enough. On holidays, afternoons, evenings, he used me because I was an instructor. I knew the area inside out. I had earlier flown in '62 in Dakotas, later on in helicopters. The only mission information we used to get was from the GLO. And I had decided as a CO, okay, we all will go to the GLO. We will listen to the briefing. No one was detailed in advance. At the end of the briefing, I will decide who are the two who are undertaking this mission. As the GLO's briefing used to progress, I could make out among the 7 of us, some people used to start smoking harder. Some faces used to turn yellow. At the end of the briefing, I said, okay, I will lead this mission, you will be my number 2. We used to come back to the...
So we have a long list of questions waiting.
Okay.
So
what I want to say, we attacked many targets, and more than 200 posts were taken over by the army. And in the Shiok sector, Chalunka was with Pakistan, Turtuk Thang was with Pakistan. We shifted the LOC by 32 kilometers. It is held by us till today. I also want to ask some authorities, why did Major Rinchin stop at Turtuk?
Sir, I'm sorry to cut you short, sir. The authorities are not here. We are only, academics and practitioners who are talking about it. So can I just request you, sir, thank you for your thought on ISR and the importance of intelligence. I think that's a very important point you make. But I have 4 more people on my list. So please.
But it should form part of the history.
Yeah. So,
I've written it, sir, given it to...
Neha, can you please pass the
different
mic?
people.
You already have it, sir.
Yeah.
Marshal Chaudhary, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make 2 quick points. One is, there is no doubt about the phenomenal offensive capability which was shown, which was actually displayed in '71 war, because we were actually freed and given full freedom of offensive operations, which wasn't, it's actually the only war we really fought without our hands tied. And I think there was some phenomenal operations which took place, but I just would like to make a mention here that very often we gloss over the strategic strikes, which unfortunately have not got enough credence. But the fact of it is the fuel system strikes did affect the fuel supply. In fact, we had trucks coming in from Iran to supply fuel. And the effectiveness of the communication and the rail network strikes, which were amply brought out. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is the only war we employed these strikes. That wasn't long enough for the strikes, to effect of the strikes to show through in a war. Probably if we had fought for another week or 10 days, there would have been distinct outcomes of the strategic strikes. But contrarily, what happens in '99, again we were constrained. So my point which I'm trying to make is that since we haven't talked much about these, a lot of Air Force's wider role, air power role, apart from pure close support and supporting the army, has been, I think, lost to history. That is one point. And the second point I would quickly like to make, I think there's been innumerable, whole lot of kinetic operations have been brought out aptly. But I think we have lost, somewhere down the line forgotten to mention the vast amount of transport operations and the immense amount of helicopter operations which went through. I know for a fact there were more than 800 casualties which were airlifted by helicopters.
Which are all part of the book.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, because
I understand. I just want to make a mention of them.
Mention
of them, the ATC officers, the fighter controllers, the whole lot of people who took part.
Thank you so much. Yeah, but we have all the authors here who have contributed, those chapters. Unfortunately, in a half-day seminar, this is all that we could manage right now, but we can have another one looking at the other dimensions. Wing Commander Yeager, you wanted to ask a question. Very briefly, please, just to the point.
Yes. Yes, ma'am. This one is for Dr. Shalini. Ma'am, you had talked about Bajwa II doctrine, in which the ceasefire was affected by him. Now, in hindsight, do you really think that it would be interesting to know who initiated that ceasefire talk, whether it was us or whether it was from the Pakistani side? And in the hindsight, do you really do you think in the events which are unfolding in Afghanistan, do you think that gave them time to regroup and do what they have been doing in Afghanistan right now? So, what should be our basically that is the question, ma'am.
Thank you very much. I'll get back to the panel now.
Ma'am, I have
Marshal
a
Bhatia.
small question, please. May I just, please, very specific one.
Very briefly, sir.
Very briefly. I just want to know the Karachi burning which took place, the timing, if you can tell the Dawn Conquest strike and the naval strike timing, if you have it, because that's very relevant. The Air Force did a good job there, and it's not been taken into account, the timing of the strike.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry to, I can see some more hands up, but I'll have to cut you short because we are beyond time, and I'm going to be guillotined for not having lunch on time.
No, just the timing. Just the timing. The Air Force strike was 0800 hours on the 4th, and the Navy strike was around 12:45, 0015 on the 5th morning.
Thank you. I'm going to give the floor now to Marshal Bhatia for exactly 1.5 minutes, sir. You can say your closing thoughts and ask your question to Shalini, and then she can have the last word.
Okay, I think this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Basically, just I wanted to say, there was a saying, I think most probably it was Hillary Clinton who said that if you cultivate snakes in your backyard, then expect them at some time to bite you back. You made a very passing kind of a remark about the Taliban. So that brings me to this question, is that, Pakistan today is rejoicing that, Taliban has taken over Afghanistan, and they think they have got their much desired, strategic depth or whatever it is, and that they will be able to control Taliban to their bidding. I want to ask you of thinking of a scenario where Taliban actually decides that now that they are firmly in control of Afghanistan, that they stop or they do not listen to Pakistan as their guides and mentors, and actually start looking at the whole thing from their own point of view. Is there a possibility that, even Pakistan is saying that the Afghan Taliban should actually take care of the TTP as well, but it may not happen. So I just like to know your thoughts on this. Is there a possibility that the Afghan Taliban will do something which will be not to the liking of Pakistan? And is there a possibility for India to actually look at how do we engage with Taliban on that matter?
Thank you, sir.
Thank
You've opened up a session for another seminar, actually. Shalini, I can only afford 1 minute for you, and you can sit with him at the lunch table and answer the other part of the question.
It's just, yeah. Thank you. To your question about Bajwa Doctrine 2.0 and the ceasefire. Ceasefire, we don't obviously know the whole thing, but it was a result of this back channel talks. Also, what I got to know in my personal capacity was it was the DGMO's initiative, but it was, yes, Bajwa's 2.0 doctrine. It was a part of that. Now, 2.0 doctrine is, one part is the ceasefire, one part was Kashmir, but it was a huge doctrine talking about the regional connectivity, economic development. It was trying to build up that base along with what was happening in Afghanistan. So, drawing a vision that, Pakistan is now behaving like a mature power and trying to imitate India in some form, and, it was done in the kind of event which we now normally have at Raisina. So that kind of event was hosted where this doctrine was pronounced. So, but then how much Pakistan is working towards it? No, it was, yes, Bajwa was in personal capacity instrumental in that, but are they all the core commanders aligned on that? I doubt that. The second answer, which I will combine both the Taliban. So the Taliban, First of all, the fallout on Pakistan. Yes, there are some sensible people in Pakistan who are talking about the fallout, but the generals don't think that way, the military doesn't think, and they seize it at the victory. Whether we can use this time of their distraction, I mean, use for what we don't need their distraction to do our strategy, our policy. I think we are doing it and we should be continuing to do that. Yes, the analysis of this collision now, because Afghanistan is an extension of their India strategy. It is having Taliban on their side and having a Taliban regime in their own mind has completely denied India space in Afghanistan. So that's the victory that it feels that it will be now able to have the regional connectivity along with China minus India. Yes, it will have its fallout on the terrorism front, which we need to guard. Very importantly, on the ideological front, it's going to have very heavy fallout, which we need to certainly take care and guard. So that preparation is definitely required. On your question, sir, about how much it is dependent on Pakistan, they are completely right now. Obviously, the support system, without the support of Pakistan, they could not have done this. They could not have succeeded in taking over Kabul and coming this far. There are many instances where we have heard about their putting their foot down and not listening to Pakistan. That might happen, that it becomes an entity, but with respect to India, will it become that entity? That is not sure, because of the support system that Pakistan offers them. And they will need the support system from Pakistan, from China, international community. Running a terror organization on narcotic money is very different from running a country. So that support system detaching to the extent that they don't listen to India and don't listen to Pakistan with respect to India, I think that's going to take, I don't know whether it will actually happen. Our engagement with Taliban, given Pakistan factor, is a big challenge, but it also depends on how Taliban now shapes up, how it conducts the governance.
So on that note, I think we can call this session to an end. Thanks to all our panelists for making such wonderful contributions, to Mr. Jagan Mohan from the US and to the two. Can I please ask you to clap for them?
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you, Chair and speakers, for such a thought-provoking discussion. I request Director General CAPS, Air Marshal Anil Chopra, to present our guests with a token of appreciation. As we have come to the end of the seminar, we now move on to the closing session. I would like to request Air Vice Marshal Anil Golani, Additional Director General CAPS, to deliver the closing remarks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm conscious of the fact that I stand between you and the lunch that awaits you after a long and invigorating and interesting session that we've had this morning on the Indo-Pak Air Battle of 1971. I think you all would agree with me that we all have been witness to seminal events in history which have changed the geography of South Asia for posterity. And I think we are privileged to be standing here or sitting here amongst people who have probably made this possible by their contribution when the birth of Bangladesh, when it took place at the end of the 1971 war. I cannot sum up by no stretch of imagination or give concluding remarks on what has happened, but just a couple of points that I would like to make, that if a nation indulges in the genocide of any kind that was done with the people in Bangladesh, it will pay the price. And I think Pakistan paid a very dear price of what it had carried out at that time. A lot has been spoken about the war, and the forces that were there in the east as well as the west. And I think one part which probably got missed out was the Battle of Longawala, in which air power played a very major role, in which, when the Pakistanis had launched this audacious attack on the Longewal-Jaisalmer sector, which was thwarted by the hunters of the Indian Air Force led by Air Marshal Mini Bawa, who's online and listening to us this morning's session. I think some words were spoken about the differences between the services which were there across the borders, whether it was in India or it was in Pakistan, between the Army and the Air Force, and the role that the Air Force had to play. But what I would like to make a comment upon is that what we need to remember is, at the end of the day, when it came to the crunch, I think we performed brilliantly, and the credit must go to the people in uniform at that time, irrespective of their color of uniform. And this is something that we need to keep in mind and learn lessons from it and look at the future as to how we need to fight future conflicts, because I don't think any future conflict is going to be an attrition battle of the kind that we witnessed in 1971. So we need to learn, we need to innovate, and we need to think of how we can apply power. In the end, it remains for me to thank all the people who have taken their time and effort to come this morning, to people who have contributed towards the book, to the veterans from whom we have so much to learn, and we are grateful for that this Air Force is still recognized as one of the finest and the best in the world today. And your contribution, I must say, has been immense in making us or taking us where we are, and we only hope that we live up to the ideals that have been, you have trained us for. I would also like to thank Group Captain Anand Rao and his team, who've worked hard at CAPS day and night to make this event possible. And in the end, I would just request you all to give a round of applause for all our veterans and those who are over here today. Thank you, and Jai Hind.